This is a full story. Puppy wishes you all a happy and enjoyable story. When the kidnappers gave Rocky the choice of saving either me or Serena, he chose me over his childhood friend, but I didn't go with him because I knew he would regret it. In the past life, after I was saved, Rocky's childhood friend was photographed in a compromising situation by the kidnappers, and the same night she committed suicide by slashing her wrists. Rocky pretended to be indifferent and went ahead with our wedding as planned, but after marriage, he made me suffer. 7 years later, I finally forced him to agree to a divorce, but on the way to file the papers, his emotions spiraled out of control, and he drove the car off a cliff. Even as he was about to die, he blamed me. We owe Serena, and we should atone for it in this life. How dare you selfishly isolate yourself? So, if I could live again, I wouldn't want to live that way. Haley, come with me. When I realized I had been reborn, the kidnappers were holding knives to both Serena's and my necks. They demanded that Rocky choose one of us to save. Rocky's gaze wandered between the two of us, and after intense internal struggle, he made the same choice as in the past. He reached out his hand to me, but I shook my head firmly. Rocky, save Serena first. In this life, I don't want to owe anyone, especially not carry a life on my conscience. When he heard that, Rocky seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Haley, you're my fiancé, I should save you first. But since you said it, don't blame me. Then he quickly took Serena and left the scene, afraid that I would change my mind at the last second. But I'm not like him, regretting after making a choice. In the past, he came rushing with the money, but the kidnappers raised their demands and said they could only take one person at a time. Reluctantly, Rocky chose me, but during the time we went to gather the extra money, the kidnappers got the idea to take advantage of Serena, and after taking compromising photos of her, they intended to assault her. Thankfully, we arrived with the police just in time, but even though they didn't complete their plan, the scene was already devastating for a girl's dignity. Serena, heartbroken, returned home and, when everyone was asleep, slashed her wrists. By the time anyone found her, it was too late. Rocky, upon hearing the news, showed no sign of caring. He calmly handled Serena's affairs and then gave her family a large sum of money. Even when I suggested postponing the wedding, he refused outright. Haley, marrying you was always part of the plan. It can't be changed just because of outsiders. But those outsiders were what he thought about for 7 years. He married me just to trap me, to atone for Serena. But what did I do wrong? After Rocky and the others left, I tried to find a way to save myself. Because this time, I wasn't sure whether Rocky would come back. In the past, he had secretly dropped a tracker into Serena's pocket while hugging her. So, even if the kidnappers moved, we could locate Serena through the tracker. But this time, it seemed like he forgot to do that. I guessed that, from the beginning. The person Rocky wanted to save was Serena. It was only because of me being his fiancé, and his fear of being criticized, that he painfully chose me. After all, we were just a family arrangement, and our feelings couldn't have been very strong. Serena had been with him through his most innocent years. They were childhood friends. More than just good friends, they were confidants. It was normal for Rocky to regret in the past life. This time, he could finally get his wish. I was happy for him. At the same time, I didn't forget to look for an opportunity to escape. I knew that when the kidnappers moved, they would pass by a car repair shop. Inside, the workers were fierce and unruly. In the past, when the kidnappers tried to take over the shop temporarily, they didn't expect the owner to be tough and refused to allow them. A fight broke out, and the kidnappers probably never expected to meet someone fiercer than themselves. In the end, they had to leave quickly, fearing the situation would escalate. Later, the kidnappers were caught, and the repair shop owner came forward as a witness. Just like in the past, they left one person behind in the car to watch me. The rest rushed to the repair shop. My hands were tied behind me, and the kidnapper in the driver's seat didn't even take me seriously. Taking advantage of his distraction, I bit the car door handle open. Then, I pushed the door open and ran like crazy. My target was the same as the kidnappers, the car repair shop. I was willing to take a gamble, hoping they wouldn't just ignore me. So, I ran right in. The repair shop was in chaos. I spotted the young repair shop owner immediately. He had sharp, refined features, radiating righteous energy, combined with his swift moves. He looked unbelievably cool. Afraid of getting caught in the crossfire, I crouched low and dashed forward at lightning speed. But I was too hasty, and accidentally knocked him to the ground. When I fell into his arms, I was so scared my face turned pale. "I am sorry," I blurted out in a flustered apology. Can you please help me? The man glanced at me and furrowed his brow. The next second, he grabbed me, and we rolled on the ground several times. Then, with a loud bang, a chair fell into the spot we had just been. If he hadn't reacted in time, I would have been in grave danger. Still shaken, the kidnappers realized I had escaped. So now, instead of occupying the area, they wanted to take me. The two sides were in a standoff. I looked up at the man beside me and whispered, "If you can save me, I'll do anything you want." But he didn't respond, instead looking at the kidnappers thoughtfully. One of his men couldn't help but remind him, "Tony, it's better to stay out of it." So his name was Tony. When I didn't get an answer, my heart began to sink. Forget it, no need to force it. As the kidnapper boss called for me a third time, I stepped forward, but soon, a hand was placed on my shoulder, forcing me to stop. Tony stepped forward and said to the kidnappers, "She's under my protection today." Just then, the roar of motorcycles sounded outside. Tony's face broke into a confident smile. "My backup is here." Hearing this, the kidnappers scowled at me and walked off, cursing under their breath. Finally, I could relax. I let out a breath, and then felt my wrist loosen. It was Tony cutting the ropes off my hands. "My name is Haley. Thank you so much for earlier," I said, extending my hand to him. Tony, however, kept staring at my wrist, where the rope had left deep red marks. It looked quite alarming. "I'll help you take care of that." I shook my head. "It's just a small injury. It's nothing." "Who just said, as long as I can save you, I'll do anything?" Without further words, he pressed me down onto the chair, then brought over a first aid kit. "Hang in there." I bit my lip, watching him carefully treat my injury. My heart warmed suddenly. I remembered the past life, when I had just married Rockey. One night, after he got drunk, as I helped him to our room, I casually mentioned that he should drink less. He immediately flew into a rage and shoved me away. I lost my balance and fell to the ground. My jade bracelet cracked when it hit the floor, the shards cutting into my wrist. I screamed in pain, clutching my bleeding wrist. Rockey, seeing this, merely stared at me coldly and said, "Does it hurt?" "It should. Serena was hurt 1,000 times more than you, but she's not even screaming anymore. If it weren't for saving you, how could she have been humiliated by the kidnappers? How could she have ended it all?" I sat there in disbelief, my heart turning colder with every passing second. After a long time, I finally found my voice. "But the kidnappers took me and Serena to threaten you. You were the one who chose to save me first. Why are you saying this to me now?" The drunken haze seemed to have mostly disappeared from Rocky's face, but his gaze was still cold. "Haley, I've always been against this marriage. If you hadn't told Grandma you liked me, she wouldn't have forced me to marry you. So, what you're saying is, if it wasn't for me, you would have only saved Serena, right?" I suddenly laughed. "Rockey, you're crazy. You don't blame the kidnappers, but you blame me instead." I stood up and went to my room to tend to my wound. From that moment on, no matter how much it hurt, I never told Rockey. Now, the person in front of me, afraid that I might be in pain, clumsily blew on my wound. My eyes started to water, and I closed them, taking a deep breath, asking, "What are you doing?" Tony looked up at me and smiled. "When I was young and got hurt, my mom always did this to make it better. Does it feel any better?" I nodded. "Much better." With that approval, Tony continued his actions. But the moment was soon interrupted. "Tony, I heard someone was causing trouble at your shop, so I rushed over." "Wow, where did you find such a beautiful girl?" A tall man with tattooed arms entered, and as soon as he saw me, his eyes lit up. "Rare indeed. I don't think I've ever seen such a pretty girl here," the tattooed man said, his face suddenly flushing with awkwardness. Tony, seeing this, immediately stepped in front of me. "Thanks, but the situation's already settled. Anything else doesn't concern you. I'll buy you a drink another time." The tattooed man froze, realizing, "Tony, now that you've got a girl, you don't even want to hang out with your brothers?" He turned his head haughtily, snorting. It seemed like he was angry. Tony rubbed his forehead, then pulled him aside, speaking in a low voice. "Can you be a little more observant? Go somewhere cool if you're just gonna hang around." "Tony, is she your girlfriend? Does it look like it?" "Yes. You two are totally a perfect match. At least you've got some sense." "I don't care. You have to treat me to wedding candy. You'll get it." The two continued to whisper not far away, although they lowered their voices. I could still clearly hear them. To ease the awkwardness, I pretended to be busy, glancing around but avoiding looking at them. A few minutes later, the tattooed man was tricked into leaving. Once he was gone, Tony asked, "Where do you live? I'll take you home." Maybe out of selfishness, I suddenly didn't want to go back so soon. Anyway, my parents were always busy with their own things. Even if I didn't go home for a month, they wouldn't ask. As for Rockey, if I guessed right, he probably also reincarnated. He should be eager to live with Serena forever now. In our past life, after 7 years of marriage, he never took me to any events and didn't sleep with me. When people asked about me, he'd always have a cold face, eventually turning me into a joke in the circle. This life, I would stay far away from him. So, I begged Tony, can you take me in for a few days? I cautiously tugged at his shirt sleeve, shaking it. From what I could tell in both lives, he seemed like a good person, and he had the ability to protect me. If I depended on him, would he refuse me? Tony suddenly leaned down close to me, his gaze intense. Little girl, if you keep this up, I might take it seriously. Maybe because we were so close, I could smell his fresh soap scent. I instinctively swallowed and was about to speak when I heard a familiar voice behind me. What are you two doing? It was Rockey. He had arrived with the police. Are you all right? Rockey looked at me, his concern seeming genuine. I shrugged. Do I look like I'm in trouble? Rockey fell silent. Serena walked in next. She glanced at the now operational repair shop and directly asked, Haley, how did you escape from the kidnappers? As far as I know, there were 6 of them. Your hands were tied, and you were unfamiliar with the area. I'm really curious. What did Serena mean by that? Everyone knows the H family and the R family are planning to merge, but they're also eyeing the land in the south of the city. And the auction is in 10 days, the highest bidder wins. But at such a critical moment this happened, and the ransom was ridiculously high. Haley, I really can't stop thinking. She's suspecting I hired the kidnappers? I admit, I've never been this speechless in both lives. I really sympathized with Serena's past, but this time, it was like I saved her. Yet after being saved, she was the first to bite me back. It was truly heartbreaking. I suddenly raised my hand and shouted, Officer, someone is slandering me. And just like that, we were all taken away. While waiting for the interrogation, Serena was still relentless. Haley, why won't you say anything? I snorted, why should I tell you? You're not a police officer. Serena was momentarily speechless. Rockey couldn't stand it anymore and immediately stepped in to speak for Serena. Haley, Serena just wants to understand the truth, so she knows what to say and what not to say during the interrogation. Well, do you still want to lie in front of the police? Rockey, enraged, stood up and pointed at me. Haley, you're impossible. Tony, just coming out of the interrogation room, saw this scene and immediately stepped in front of me. Put your hand down. His tone was calm but carried an irresistible pressure. I hid behind Tony, unable to see their expressions, but I could sense the tension in the air. I heard Rockey ask, Who are you to her? Tony turned his face to look at me, a slight smile on his lips. He asked in return, What do you think? I looked up, gazing at his overly perfect profile, and instinctively, I made a heart shape with my thumb and index finger. Rockey saw this and immediately turned even darker. At that moment, the police called him to make a statement. After a round of questioning, things began to take shape. The police had identified the suspects, but they had to capture the kidnappers first before proceeding with further investigations. But I knew this was the work of Rockey's competitor. After leaving the police station, Tony looked at me and said, It's fine. What? I asked, confused. He explained, The thing you asked me about this afternoon, it's fine. Finally, I understood. He was referring to my request for him to let me stay with him. My family only consists of my mom and me. She's back at the old house, and I usually stay at the repair shop. You can stay however you like. I was about to agree when Rockey spoke up. Haley, your mom and dad already know about your kidnapping. They should be landing soon and heading home. Are you sure you don't want to go back? I couldn't help but feel a pang in my heart. Rockey, an outsider, knew more about my parents than I did. Ever since I could remember, they were always busy. Too busy to remember my birthday, too busy to attend parent-teacher meetings. I even deliberately did poorly in school or hurt myself, just so they would briefly show up and give me a little attention. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything and began celebrating my own birthday, inviting a flower shop aunt to attend the meetings because she was kind and beautiful. I grew up lonely until I met Rockey. On the school basketball court, he casually blocked a ball that was about to hit me. Under the sunlight, the young man looked extraordinarily handsome. A few drops of sweat slid from his forehead, shining like diamonds. He glanced at me with a hint of arrogance and said, Careful, classmate. With his cool voice, I was instantly smitten. Back then, I was timid. I muttered thank you, and ran off. Afterward, I kept an eye on him, knowing he had a good childhood friend. But it seemed like their relationship was stuck in the childhood sweethearts phase. As I quietly harbored my youthful crush, my feelings grew. Even when we accidentally met or exchanged glances, I knew that I probably wouldn't be able to control my future marriage. So when I found out that my marriage partner was going to be Rockey, I was overjoyed. My parents were also fond of him and contacted him more often than me. In the last life, when I proposed to divorce Rockey, I was directly rejected. Rockey is capable and can tolerate your bad habits. Don't you cherish him? Do we have to worry about you? I knew that after we married, the interests of the H and our families were tied together, and divorce wasn't a simple matter. So I endured year after year until I developed depression and started self-harming, which finally forced Rockey to agree to a divorce. Now, with a second chance, I wanted to live for myself. That's why I didn't want to go home. But then I suddenly remembered, there was one more thing to resolve. I had to go back home for it. Before leaving, I took Tony's phone from his pocket, entered my number, and dialed it. Only when I heard the ringtone did I return the phone to him. Make sure to save my number. I'll come find you in a few days. I then flagged down a taxi and left without looking at Rockey. At home, I found my parents waiting for me in the living room. Before I could speak, they began to scold me. Rockey already told us about today's events. Can't you stop being so reckless? Those were kidnappers who might have killed you. And you let Rockey save someone else first? My mom sighed heavily. How can we trust you with the company? They didn't trust me, so they handed the company to Rockey in the last life. Then they relaxed, chasing after their youthful dreams. Suddenly, my dad, who had been sitting on the couch, spoke up. Why don't you settle the marriage soon? I disagree, I said firmly. I came back to tell you that tomorrow, I'm going to Rockey's house to cancel the engagement. Whether you agree or not, I'm going to make my own decision. And don't try to use the company to threaten me. You can give it to whoever you want. If not me, that's fine. I don't want it anyway. With this, I went back to my room. They were probably more disappointed in me now. I didn't care anymore. The next day, I woke up early, but when I went downstairs, my mom had already made breakfast and was waiting for me. I heard from Aunt Fong that you were up last night looking for food. It's my fault. I forgot to ask if you had dinner. I froze, confused by how suddenly gentle and considerate my mom had become. She lovingly tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and said with regret, "Your dad and I reflected last night. Maybe we've been using the wrong approach all these years. We wanted you to grow up independent, so we didn't give you too much affection, afraid of spoiling you. But if you want to make your own decisions, that's fine. We're not going to force you to marry into the R family." Was this their way of agreeing to the cancellation of my engagement? I suddenly felt very bittersweet. When I was younger, I would argue and cry, but all I received was scolding. Later, I learned to be obedient, thinking it would make them pay attention to me. But in the end, they just saw me as weak and useless. Now, I simply used their methods to say some harsh words, and it seemed to change their attitude. By the time the car arrived at Rockey's villa, I still couldn't believe it. At first, the idea of the H and our family marriage was proposed by Rockey's grandmother. It all started when I saved Rockey's mother, who had fainted from low blood sugar at a banquet. The old lady was very grateful and insisted on adopting me as her god-granddaughter. After that, we became familiar with each other. I even visited the R family's old house for meals. It was there that I met Rockey and realized the old lady was his grandmother. She was sharp and immediately saw that I liked Rockey. That's when things started moving forward. Now, asking me to cancel the engagement in front of her felt like I was betraying her. After all, she had given me the bracelet passed down in the R family. But now, it seemed like I had no choice but to return it. Rockey arrived before me and Serena was with him. They were both dressed formally. If I canceled the engagement, they could immediately get engaged. Everything was for the sake of everyone's happiness. But when I placed the bracelet on the table, Rockey grabbed my wrist and asked, "What does this mean?" I had only told him to meet at the R family home, but didn't mention the engagement cancellation. Rockey's mother looked at us and seemed to realize something. "Haley, did Rockey do something wrong to you?" she said, casting a sharp glance at Serena. I respectfully addressed Rockey's mother. "Ms. Alice, I'm the one who wants to cancel the engagement with Rockey." My tone was calm, as if describing the weather. Hearing this, Rockey's eyes widened in disbelief. "Why?" "Because yesterday you left me to save someone else. I think that's the person you want to marry, right?" I glanced at Serena, who was staring at me with a stubborn, innocent look. "No," Rockey said, his eyes filled with self-doubt. "Wasn't it you who told me to save Serena first? I was testing you, and the result is clear." Rockey fell silent. Alice sighed and said, "I've heard about yesterday's events. You're a good girl. It's Rockey who doesn't deserve you." "Grandma," Rockey suddenly interrupted Alice. He tightened his grip on my wrist, as if trying to crush the bones. "Haley, I won't agree. You don't stand a chance." The wound from yesterday hadn't healed yet, and his grip made it bleed again. I endured the pain but suddenly found it amusing. In the last life, Rockey mourned Serena's death for 7 years. Now, after being reborn, he couldn't wait to save Serena. I thought he was deeply in love with her and couldn't wait to marry her. I forced a smile and said, "If you want to do this, I'll find the media tomorrow and announce the cancellation of the engagement. Then, it'll be our family's face that gets ruined." With that, I pried his fingers off and walked away. I didn't expect Rockey to chase after me. Just in time, Tony's motorcycle arrived at Rockey's doorstep. Not wanting to get entangled with Rockey further, I simply said, "Sorry, my boyfriend is here to pick me up." Rockey furrowed his brows in displeasure and mocked. "Haley, are you sure you want to choose this poor guy as your boyfriend? Can he really make you happy? Or should I choose someone like you, who's so hypocritical and fickle?" With that, I walked toward Tony, but the next second, my wrist was grabbed again. I gasped in pain. Rockey, the one responsible, finally noticed the injury on my wrist. He panicked and tried to explain. I didn't know you were hurt." I lowered my eyes, smiling sarcastically, as if knowing would make you care. Tony couldn't stand it anymore. He rushed up and landed a punch that knocked Rockey to the ground, fast and precise. Rockey spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes filled with rage, but he didn't dare to make another move. Tony, seeing this, warned him in a stern tone, "Stay away from her." He then put his helmet on my head, revved the engine, and we drove off. The motorcycle sped through the mountains, the scenery changing rapidly before my eyes. I leaned against Tony's back, feeling the thrill of the speed. It was as if the unpleasantness from earlier could be forgotten for a while. "Girlfriend, where do you plan to go?" Tony's voice came from the front. I chuckled softly. It seemed he had heard what I said earlier. Naturally, I wrapped my arms around his waist and said, "Since you called me your girlfriend, can I visit your place? I'm hungry." "Of course, no problem. I'm quite good at cooking." "Then I want 4 dishes. Consider it done." Tony's laughter echoed through the mountains. I wasn't sure if it was his influence, but at that moment I felt incredibly lighthearted. Tony's house was bigger than I had imagined. He hurriedly brought me a brand new pair of men's slippers. They might be a bit big, but it's the only new pair I have. I slipped them on casually and smiled. "It's fine. Luckily, I come back sometimes to clean up, so it shouldn't be too messy." Despite being the host, it was him who felt uneasy. I plopped down on the sofa, propped my chin in my hand, and looked at him, saying, "I don't cook, so you'll have to work hard today." Instead of immediately going to cook, Tony brought over a first aid kit. The wound I had bandaged yesterday had bled again after Rockey squeezed it, and the blood had stuck to the gauze, drying and adhering to the wound. Tony carefully poured iodine onto the gauze, trying to loosen the gauze from the wound. He performed this meticulous task seriously, despite being a big man. Half an hour later, he had rebandaged it. He didn't forget to remind me, "Don't get it wet for the next couple of days." I instinctively asked, "How am I supposed to take a shower then?" "You can go without a shower for 2 days. Don't worry." He thought for a moment and added, "I won't mind." "You dare." "I don't dare." "Humph. Then, shall I go make dinner?" I smiled and nodded. I suddenly realized that every time I was with Tony, I felt particularly at ease. An hour later, he brought out 4 dishes. They were sweet and sour pork, garlic shrimp, steamed fish, and cold cucumber salad. He handed me the chopsticks. "Try them out." After trying a few dishes, I gave him a thumbs up. The colors, aroma, and taste were perfect, unforgettable, just like him. It seems I won't have to worry about where to eat from now on. In the afternoon, I received a call from my dad. The gist of it was that he wanted me to attend the auction in 10 days, saying if I could secure the land in the south of the city, the company would be fully entrusted to me. I knew about the land, and besides Rockey and Haley, there were several other companies interested in it. In my past life, I had been traumatized by the kidnapping incident, and later, with Serena's death, I couldn't have been unaffected. I fell ill and missed that auction, but even if I hadn't gotten sick, I wouldn't have competed with Rockey. At that time, my mind and heart were filled with him. I thought I had finally found someone to spend my life with, but the R family was facing a debt crisis, and it was hard for Rockey to secure the land. In the end, I transferred some money from the H family to help him. Rockey succeeded in the auction, and after securing the land, he built a theme park, attracting investors. In just a few years, the R family rose to new heights. It was clear that the land was a guaranteed profit, or else so many people wouldn't be interested. This time, I had to win, but I didn't expect Serena to come to beg me. Her attitude was different from a few days ago, much more humble. This time, she lowered herself and pleaded with me in a humble tone. "Could you not divorce Rockey? He and I have only ever been friends. If you agree, I'll never show up in front of you again." I silently stared at her, feeling only speechless. Yes, in my past life, I also thought they were just good friends. But after Serena died, Rockey's actions were clearly more than just mourning a good friend. I remember the day he agreed to divorce me. It was after I had suffered from depression and self-harmed for the 10th time. He came back to find me lying on the floor, covered in blood. He was probably afraid I would die in his house, so he finally agreed to the divorce. But on the way to the divorce, he suddenly asked me, "Do you know today is Serena's death anniversary?" I looked at him blankly and shook my head. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone remember that. But my reaction completely angered Rockey. He furiously punched the steering wheel and scolded me for being cold-hearted. "You're living the life Serena gave up hers for, but you never appreciated it. You even forgot her death anniversary. All you think about is leaving. Do you think you can escape your conscience that way? Haley, you disgust me." I was also furious and retorted, "Yes, you understand gratitude. You can't forget her. So why don't you go die with her?" The moment I finished speaking, the car suddenly swerved uncontrollably and plummeted off the cliff. Even before dying, Rockey still blamed me. It was us who owed Serena, and we should redeem ourselves in this life. How dare you sit comfortably? But in this life, we owe each other nothing. I'm curious to see what kind of ending Rockey will have. I made a gesture to Serena, signaling her to stop talking. After all, constantly thinking about the past life really disgusts me. Do you not understand the situation? Both the R family and the H family have already agreed that this engagement is null and void. Did Rockey send you here? She shook her head. No, it's because I don't want to see him lose. Haley, didn't you always like Rockey before? This time, it's my fault. I shouldn't have suspected you hired the kidnappers. And I shouldn't have suddenly come back from abroad. If I hadn't, Rockey wouldn't have gotten hurt saving me, and you wouldn't have been sad. I was a little dizzy from her words. Don't want to see him lose? Serena explained, their family needs the land in the southern city to turn things around. Haley, if you're determined to break off the engagement, can you not compete with Rockey for it? I sneered. Are you dreaming? Now I finally understood. In my previous life, when we rushed to save Serena, the police had already captured the kidnappers, and the large ransom was successfully recovered. Plus, I had helped Rockey with money from the H family, which allowed him to successfully acquire the land. But now, because of my self-rescue, the kidnappers had been alarmed and fled, and the police still had no leads, let alone being able to recover the ransom. It seems the R family had already lost the advantage in securing the land. Serena still wouldn't give up. She gritted her teeth and suddenly knelt down in front of me. Haley, I beg you, you don't have to love him, but can you not destroy him? I had seen moral blackmail before, but this was a level I hadn't encountered. I bent down, leaned close to her, and whispered, "When you heard about Rocky's arranged marriage with me, you went abroad. But when you found out about our engagement, you suddenly came back. You're right, all of this is your fault. So, you should help him. Your family, the Serena family, may not be as rich as the H family, but at least you can help, right? Besides, he saved you with money last time, and it has nothing to do with me. You come to beg me, should I say you're stupid or am I?" Serena turned pale as she heard this. She opened her mouth, but didn't say anything more. If she understood, that would be best. If not, it would be her own problem. During this time, I returned home, only to find that my parents had left again. It seemed like they were still the same, pursuing their own ambitions without changing. What they needed was just a qualified heir. They didn't care who it was. Forget it, it's as if I really care about them. I stayed at home for 2 days, and my hand had nearly healed. I took a car from the garage and headed straight for Tony's repair shop. I didn't see Tony right away, but I did run into the guy with the big tattooed arms. He awkwardly called out, "Hello, sister-in-law." "Where's Tony?" I asked him. He scratched his head and replied, "Tony went out. Is there something you need from him?" He then slapped his mouth and muttered, "Can't you look for him for no reason? Look at my silly mouth." Then he grinned at me, "Please sit for a bit, sister-in-law. Tony should be back soon." I nodded and sat on the sofa. On the coffee table, there were several different tea sets. I made myself a pot of tea and slowly tasted it. The tattooed guy didn't leave. He was obviously very curious, and his eyes kept sneaking glances at me. Seeing that I was brewing tea myself, he explained, "I'm a rough guy, I don't know how to do this kind of thing. Tony usually makes tea for me, hope you don't mind." I looked up and asked, "What's your name?" "Jack. Is Tony good to you?" I don't know why, but I just had this feeling. Jack shook his head, and I thought I had guessed wrong. But then he said, "No, Tony is good to all of us." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, tell me more." Most of the people working at this repair shop come from poor rural areas, and they all have some physical disabilities. For example, the one who repairs the engines. Kwan can't speak, but he can identify where the problem is just by hearing the sound. Then there's Chin Ping, who takes care of maintenance. He has a limp, and Dan, who sprays paint, can't read a word. When they first came to this city, they just wanted to make a living, but after arriving, they realized that with their physical disabilities, no diploma, and no skills, skills, it was hard to even find a decent job. It was Tony who took them in, gave them time to learn skills, provided food and housing, and even paid them. And so, these people have all followed Tony faithfully, and they won't go anywhere else. I see. I looked back at Jack and asked, "What about you?" At that moment, for the first time, a serious expression appeared on his face. I met Tony 5 years ago. I offended someone and almost got beaten to death. It was Tony who saved me. Since then, I vowed to follow Tony for life. If anyone dares to bully him, they'll have to step over my dead body first. To be honest, hearing these words, I was shaken inside. All my life, I've lived in solitude, and few people have treated me sincerely. But Tony was able to gather such a group of people who followed him honestly. I was really envious and suddenly wanted to see him as soon as possible. "Do you know where he went?" Jack thought for a moment and said, "Tony didn't say exactly where, just that someone was looking for him. I think it's somewhere near Tiancheng Square." Just as I was about to leave, Jack seemed to remember something and said, "Oh, by the way, sister-in-law, Tony is actually quite wealthy, but he's low-key about it. Originally, he didn't want us to call you sister-in-law. He said you're from a rich family and that we should call you a miss." I frowned. Why is Tony still using such old-fashioned titles? But what I never expected was to see Tony and Serena sitting together at the cafe in Tiancheng Square. I didn't know what Serena was saying to Tony, but her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. Tony was just listening, and his frown hadn't loosened. After a while, Serena suddenly stood up and moved from across to sit next to Tony. Something about this felt off. If it were me before today, I might have just walked away and blocked Tony. After all, after being hurt once, I couldn't tolerate any impure relationships. But, if it's Tony, I want to trust him just once. Just as I was about to enter the cafe, I saw Tony quickly stand up and leave his seat as if trying to avoid something unpleasant. Then he ran into me, our eyes met. Compared to my calmness, Tony froze for a moment. He clearly didn't expect to see me here, but then he quickly walked toward me. "Haley." Serena also chased out at that moment, her face filled with urgency. "Mr. Tony, if you agree, I." Serena's words stopped abruptly when she saw me, but she quickly composed herself and asked, "Haley, how come you're here? Did you come to see Mr. Tony too?" she asked, leaning slightly toward Tony. But Tony was very alert. As soon as she leaned in, he immediately stepped forward and positioned himself between us. He looked at me with a somewhat innocent expression and said, "Haley, I pretended to be angry. I'll deal with you later." Serena looked at our interaction, her eyes dimming. "Haley, I really underestimated you." I shrugged and replied, "Right, I thought so too." Serena was left speechless, her face turning all sorts of colors, green, white, red, a very dramatic look. To be honest, I wasn't the type to be easily taken advantage of. If I hadn't been so caught up with people who didn't care about me in my past life, I wouldn't have ended up like that. Tony brought me home. By this time, it was almost dark. We were sitting on the couch in silence. After a long time, he was the first to break the silence. "Aren't you going to ask? Didn't you say you were going to come back and deal with me?" I said quietly, "If you want to say something, you'll say it even if I don't ask. If you don't want to, it doesn't matter if I ask." Tony had no expression on his face. "Do you know why Serena came to find me?" I shook my head. On the way back, I had thought of many possibilities. For example, maybe Serena liked Tony. Or maybe Rockey didn't like us being good together and deliberately sent Serena to annoy me. After all, they were close, and they were willing to do anything for each other. But Tony suddenly asked if I was interested in the land in the southern city. I was shocked. "How do you know?" "Because the land rights are in my hands now. It's something my dad left for me." What a coincidence. Wait, so Serena still hadn't given up and came directly to Tony, trying to get something from him? But how did she know the land belonged to Tony? The only answer was that Rockey told her. When he took the land in the past, he must have contacted Tony, so he knew. When I saw Tony staring at me, I immediately realized something. "You don't think I came close to you because of this land, do you?" A strange, uncomfortable feeling surged in my heart. I was worried about him, but he was doubting me too. I lowered my head, wanting to laugh, but couldn't. Tony suddenly lifted my face, seriously saying, "Fool, I never thought that." At first, the thought did cross my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. "I trust my judgment," I asked, "just like when you saved Jack and the others?" Tony raised an eyebrow. "No, you're different from them. I saved them because I was kind, but I saved you because I was moved." "Tony, you're really something." I pouted, slightly dissatisfied. "So good at this. I wonder how many others he's dated." Tony looked at me indulgently, his hand still on my face, gently forcing me to look up. Then, a kiss fell, light as a dragonfly's touch, just a brief contact. It's not about being good, it's about being natural, following my instincts. I felt my cheeks heat up, and my heartbeat raced. Afraid of being discovered in this state, I buried my face in his chest. My ear pressed against his chest, the sound of his heartbeat thunderous and deafening, again and again, as if loudly declaring his love for me. I closed my eyes and felt it for a long time, before saying, "Tony, I like you as much as you like me." He didn't answer, but his actions spoke for him. He held me tighter, as if trying to merge me into his very bones. The next morning, Tony handed me a document. I took it and saw it was a land transfer agreement, and to my shock, it had my name on it. "Tony, are you crazy? Do you know what this means?" I couldn't believe it. How could anyone be this foolish? "I've canceled the bid. The thing you wanted, I have it. No reason not to give it to you." It was impossible not to be moved. My heart felt full, warm, and swollen. I blinked, forcing back the tears. This was a good thing. I couldn't cry. Since he had shown such sincerity, I couldn't fall behind. I grabbed his hand and said as we walked, "Before you sign, let's go somewhere." I took him to the Civil Affairs Bureau. Tony repeatedly confirmed with me, "Are you sure about this?" I looked at him and smiled. "Aren't you afraid I'll take your stuff, then kick you out and find someone richer and handsomer?" Tony frowned and thought for a moment. "Well, I can't say richer, but finding someone handsomer is probably impossible." Yes, so I guess I've trapped you, huh? I didn't expect Rockey to show up so quickly. Just as Tony and I came out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, holding our red booklets, Rockey saw us and his face turned pale with anger. Even his clenched fists were trembling. He spoke, "Haley, you've really chosen him." "Crazy." I rolled my eyes, not planning to respond. But Rockey grabbed my arm, and suddenly 2 lines of tears rolled down his face. These must be crocodile tears, right? But I did have something to say to Rockey, so I told Tony to wait in the car. Once it was just the 2 of us, Rockey hurriedly said, "Haley, I regret it. I really regret it. You can hit me, curse me, anything. Just please forgive me." I sneered, asking, "Regret? Regret what? Regret not saving me, or regret not treating me well in the last life?" At my words, Rockey released my wrist, and the color drained from his face. It seemed even he didn't want to remember the past life. After all, the past clearly exposed his wrongdoings. At this moment, Rockey began slapping himself, muttering, "I was foolish. I was wrong. I deserve to die. But Haley, is there still a chance for us?" I paused for a moment, then asked indifferently, "Rockey, what do you think?" He stopped slapping himself, lowering his eyes, his face despondent. Suddenly, his eyes lit up as if he had thought of something. "No, it's Serena. It's all her fault. If she hadn't come back suddenly, none of this would have happened. And I never sent her to find you. She did it on her own, one-sidedly." He grabbed my hand again, pleading pitifully, "Please, trust me one last time. I've always loved you, really. I know I've wronged you, so I won't ask for anything. Just look at me. Even if I have to do anything, I'll do it." I stared at Rockey in shock, not believing these words were coming from his mouth. I yanked my hand back, even wiping it on my clothes. "Rockey, what do you want?" Of course, I didn't believe he really loved me. Once you've experienced true love, you only see this as worthless garbage. Rockey gave me a deeply affectionate look. "I understood too late, but I won't give up on you." I felt a chill, like being haunted by a ghost. "Rockey, if you keep this up, I'll call the police." Rockey froze, tears streaming down like there was no tomorrow. I was just irritated and couldn't wait to leave. "Rockey, you've only ever loved yourself. No matter if it's Serena or me, neither of us matters more than your own interests. But you can't stand it, can you? Why is it that after I left you, I'm doing better? So now you want to pull me back into the abyss?" But Rockey, I'm not alone anymore. My husband is fierce and tough, and he has a whole group of people willing to do anything for him. If you're looking for trouble, feel free to try. I glanced at Serena, who had followed us without making a sound. I hoped she would finally see Rockey for who he really was and stop being sold while counting the money for the other person. It was as if a farce had come to an end. After my father learned that I had successfully secured the land, he kept his promise and handed over the company for me to manage. I didn't tell them that Tony and I had gotten our marriage certificate because I didn't want anyone disturbing us. I just wanted to quietly live our life together. Every day, I balanced between work and home, and time quietly slipped away. Not long after, I heard that Serena was going abroad. The person who loved Rockey the most in this world no longer wanted him. Before she left, she posted a long message on social media, condemning Rockey for his betrayal, how cold-hearted and ruthless he was. With nothing else to do, I decided to boost her post's visibility. As a result, their family, already in financial crisis, was further affected. Their stocks plummeted, and it was said that bankruptcy was imminent. Rockey, busy and overwhelmed, was desperately seeking help everywhere. But at that point, who would be willing to help him? So, he came to me. It had been several months since we last met. I was now busy developing the land, excited about the potential profits to come. But the Rockey in front of me was unrecognizable from the one I had seen months ago. His face was unusually thin, dark circles under his eyes, his beard unkempt, and he radiated a sense of despair. I asked him, "Do you want me to help you?" To my surprise, he shook his head. He told me, "Haley, I've been suffering from depression and haven't had a good night's sleep in months. I finally understand the pain you went through. This is my retribution." I forced back the smile that was rising on my lips and said, "How can this be retribution? This is your blessing." Think about it, in your past life, you regretted not saving Serena even when you had success and fame. You still weren't happy with me by your side. Now, fate has given you another chance. Even though you have nothing left, you've corrected the regrets of your previous life. That's enough. Fate hasn't been harsh on you. People can't be too greedy. Once you gain something, you may lose something else. You can't always want it all. That was the last time I saw Rockey. Because 3 months later, on the night their family announced their complete bankruptcy, Rockey, drunk and suffering from depression, fell into the bathtub. By the time someone found him, it was too late. Indeed, what goes around comes around. Retribution is inevitable. When Tony heard about this, he was giving me a back rub. My dad once told me that if a person's character isn't good, they won't go far. I turned over and couldn't help but ask, "So how far do you think we can go?" Tony thought about it seriously, then said, "With our characters, 100 years isn't too much, right?" I couldn't agree more. It's definitely not too much. Then, it's not too much for a husband to want a full meal, right? Tony looked at me with burning eyes, his gaze reflecting me like the most beautiful rose in the world. They say that loving someone is like nurturing a flower. Tony placed me at the top of his heart, caring for me, unwilling to let me suffer any hardship. As a result, I became more and more outstanding. The things I never got in 2 lifetimes, Tony gave me abundantly. I reached up and kissed his lips, saying, "Not too much." The end. If you like Puppy's story, please follow and like it. Updated every morning at 9 a.m.